Evening. Welcome to the City Council meeting of Wednesday, October 21st. Can I have a roll call, please?
Salem Derby.
Present.
Dan Hagan.
Present.
Jennifer Hayes.
Here.
JP Kuzinski.
Here.
Joe McCoy.
Here.
Dan Rist.
Here.
Tamara Smith.
Here.
Joy Winnie.
Here.
Nathan Ziegler.
Here. We all please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Could I please have a motion for the approval of the minutes
So
of October
moved.
7th? Second. Motion is second for approval of the October 7 minutes. Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Any abstentions? One abstention. Okay, public speak time. If there's someone from the public who would like to address the council for something other than what's on the public hearings, please come forward. I recognize everyone in the audience, so I don't think they're there. Okay, communications from elected officials, boards, and committees. Council Rist, just want to mention our communication from the planning board?
Yeah, we have the recommendation from the planning board. It's the update to the city zoning map. I don't think any action has to take place on this,
No.
so it is for our information only.
Okay. That is currently with ordinance and planning, so it's being
It's
worked
already
out.
in plan ordinance.
Financial, are you speaking, Melissa, I'm sorry. Are you?
Financial director.
I think we went through it.
I think Salem knows
Oh.
something too.
I'm
No
sorry,
news
hold
is
on.
good
Did you wanna-
news.
Did you want to mention that?
Sure, this just came.
Yeah, I'm
Salem
sorry.
Yeah,
Is that what
sorry.
you're saying?
We have one more announcement.
Okay.
Did you just give me this, Salem?
Salem just
I did.
Salem's gonna announce it.
Okay, so for an announcement for all of those parents who have student athletes, the Greater East Hampton Student Athlete Foundation is presenting a program called Get Recruited, the College Athletic Recruiting Seminar. It's October 24th, 2015 at 7 p.m. at the new East Hampton High School auditorium. And the cost for East Hampton High School parents and Hampshire Regional parents is $10. It's free to students from those schools. And this is something that if you were going to go to it outside of the schools would cost around $50. So it's a good deal, and it has a lot of really good information about the students who are planning to play sports after high school.
Thank you.
Sorry, Council President. I'm talking about communications. I just wanted to say thanks again to Nikki Dees. I don't know how many of us noticed the shuttle van parked out in front of the building today. That's a really attractive van.
I saw it too.
And very clean interior. It looks good. Should give us a lot of good service. Thank you to Nikki Dees.
Great. I'm sorry, Finance Director Zawadzki, did you want to stand in for the mayor tonight, or is there just no mayor communications as far as? Okay, thank you very much. That's all I needed to know. So it's time to move on to standing committees, rules and government relations. Councilor Rist.
No report, Mr. President, thank you.
Finance, Councilor Hagan.
Finance, first I left a copy of the city motor vehicle list to all the councilors, because I know we have a lot of vehicles before the finance committee, so a couple of councilors inquired about how many vehicles the city had, and so I left everyone a copy. I also left a sheet for the amount in free cash and retained earnings for your perusal. On our agenda, I need to set 4 public hearings, and I'll do them in order. And these will all be for the November, there'll be 5 public hearings. These will all be for the November 4th meeting. One is for the FY 2016 tax classification, and the other 4 are for supplemental appropriations, one for $30,000 for a 3/4 ton pickup, one for $46,200 for a 3/4 ton pickup, and another for $47,000 for replacement of a 3/4 ton pickup, and $68,000 for design of a replacement water main under the Ferry Street Bridge. And I'll make that in the form of a motion for public hearings on all those matters.
Second?
Okay, we have a motion and a second to set public hearings on November 4th for the 4 previously read supplemental appropriations as well as the FY 2016 tax classification. Any other discussions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, motion passes.
Our next meeting will be next Wednesday, the 28th, at 6 p.m. in room 1, and that's it until new business.
Do you want to do that extension for the dogs?
Oh, yes, thank you, President McCoy. I'd also like a 90-day extension on the kettle donation account, as the mayor is still obtaining information from the city solicitor on that.
Second.
Okay, a motion and a second for 90-day extension on the kennel donation account. Any additional comments, questions? All those in favor? Aye, oppose, abstain, motion passes. That
And as I
concludes-
said, other than the new business, which we can take up, that's it for
Thanks so
now.
much, we'll do the end. Public safety, Counselor Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. President. The review of the street acceptance protocol is ongoing, and I would like to request a 90-day extension for that, and I'll put that in the form of a motion.
Second.
Okay, a motion and a second for a 90-day extension for the review of the street acceptance protocols. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstain, motion passes.
Thank you. And then we met last week with a representative from Verizon, Paul Davis, I believe, about 2 utility requests on Brook Street, and I would like to set a public hearing for that for our next meeting, please, which is November 6th, I
Fourth.
believe. 4th.
Second.
Okay, a motion and a second to set a public hearing November 4th for the utility request on Brook Street. Additional comments, questions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstain, motion passes.
This concludes public safety.
Okay, thank you. Appointments, Counselor Winnie?
I have no report tonight. However, I do have 9 appointments in new business. Would you like me to take care of that now?
Well, we've been doing everybody else at the end, so I'll
Okay.
come back.
All right,
Thank you for asking. Ordinance, Counselor Derby?
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to let everybody know that our next meeting is going to be on the 28th, next Wednesday at 6 p.m. At that point, we're going to review the planning board's recommendation that we got this evening and look at a couple of things that might have been omitted to bring to the full council. And at that point, I guess I would like to set a public hearing for November 4th at 6:15 p.m. in these chambers on the request to update, amend, correct the city zoning map.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, a motion and a second to set a public hearing for November 4th on the request to update the city's zoning map. Any additional discussions? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstain, motion passes.
That concludes.
Okay, property, Counselor Ziegler.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report this evening. Thus concludes.
Okay. Old business, pending business, we still are assembling names for the boardwalk naming, but I would like to ask for in form of a motion, a 90-day extension on that.
Second.
A motion, a second for a 90-day extension on the boardwalk naming. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstain. Motion passes. Looks like we have time, so why don't we go back to new business? Counselor Hagan, do you want to start?
Sure, I have 4 new supplemental appropriations that I'll do a first reading. The first is dated October 15th, 2015. The request is hereby made for approval of following appropriation. The amount requested is $18,000 to be appropriated from free cash in that amount and appropriated to the fire department capital. The amounts requested will be used for the following purpose: to provide funds to purchase protective clothing for the fire department. The second supplemental appropriation, also dated October 15th, 2015, is request is hereby made for approval of the following appropriation. The amount requested is $50,000 to be appropriated from enterprise retained earnings in that amount, and it'll be appropriated to the wastewater treatment capital project. The amount requested to be used for the following purpose: to provide funds for the Trueheart Drive Adam Street Pump Station improvements. The third supplemental appropriation, dated October 15th, 2015, is request is hereby made for the following appropriation. The amount requested is $50,000 to be appropriated from enterprise retained earnings in that amount and appropriated to the Water Enterprise Capital Project. The amount requested to be used for the following purpose: to provide funds to purchase replacement water meters. And the final supplemental appropriation, dated October 15th, 2015, request is hereby made for approval of the following appropriation. The amount requested is $150,000 to be appropriated from free cash in that amount and appropriated to capital stabilization. The amount requested to be used for the following purpose: to provide funds to the capital stabilization fund. And I'll make that, those 4 supplemental appropriations in the form of a motion that they be sent to finance.
Okay, a motion and a second to send those supplemental appropriations to finance. Additional discussions? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstained, motion passes. The FY 2016 capital plan, there's no action required, it's just for the counselors' information, so you'll find that in your packet. The next one down, I believe, is ordinance. Counselor Derby.
Yes, I would like to make a motion to have a consideration of creating a food truck ordinance sent to the ordinance subcommittee.
Second.
Okay, a motion, a second to add, to send to ordinance, topic of a food truck ordinance for new business. Additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, motion passes. I believe C and D are public safety. Counselor Hayes.
Hi, I would like to make a motion to move to subcommittee to look at the no parking area on Industrial Parkway. I've had a request from a resident and Chief McMahon.
You want to do, actually, we'll do both of them.
We'll do both of them. And also to look at on-street parking along the section of Pleasant Street between the former National Felt Building to the American Legion.
Okay, so
Second.
a motion to move to public safety, the no parking on Industrial Avenue and the on-street parking on Pleasant Street. Any additional comments or questions? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstained, motion passes. Mayoral appointments, Counselor Wing.
Yes, I move that the 9 mayoral appointments be moved to appointment subcommittee meeting.
Second.
Okay, a motion, a second, to move the 9 mayoral appointments to the appointment subcommittee. Any additional questions, discussion? Unseen, all those in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstained, motion passes.
Thank you. Our next meeting will be November 4th at 5:15 and downstairs in one of the rooms.
Okay. Information. So I think we have about 3 minutes until public hearing, so, Counselor,
Yep, I forgot to make an announcement earlier that the Rag Shag Parade is coming up this next week. It's gonna be on Tuesday, October 27th at 6:30, starting at the Maple School. And it will be ending in the parking lot for East Hampton Savings Bank. So
That's
it's
important.
6:30 on Tuesday.
we usually have something about that. Thank
Very
you for
important.
noticing. Okay, so I'll just take a 2-minute recess until 6:15, and then we'll reassemble right here.
I'm missing one of these.
Public hearings.
So moved.
A motion, a second, to open public hearings. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, motion passes. Counselor Derby, I believe this is you
Yep.
tonight.
So what we have on the agenda is a proposed special act that gets sent to the legislature for additional liquor licenses. And so the process that our committee went through was to look at the licenses that we had, look at other communities in the area that have proactively gone after liquor licenses that weren't bound to a particular location, like the ones that we have done in the past. We've done quite a few in the past. The Art Bar, Popcorn Noir, Galaxy, the Hideaway. We did one for a resident on Chapman Ave. And so we had, in my tenure, we've done quite a few. And probably about 8 years ago, we entertained the idea of going after more. So they could be sent to the licensing board, and the licensing board, if a project came that made sense for East Hampton, they would have the ability to grant a license for that location and that project. Since then, other communities have gone after these. For example, Holyoke, Northampton, Hadley, which we looked at pretty closely. Hadley went for 12 overquoted liquor licenses. And they did a mixture of 6 full and 6 wine and malt. So as we deliberated, we decided, we settled on a number, looking at, probably since it's been 10 years since I've been on the council, looking at a 10-year view, how many potentially could East Hampton support? And we came up with the number of 8, 4 full and 4 wine and malt. The 2 of the specifics that are important to note is we specifically put an emphasis on the Mill Industrial District and the Downtown Business District as areas, and Union Street specifically. We didn't write it in the act, because I wasn't sure how the legislature would react to us putting a specific street in. So those were the two areas that we felt could benefit the most from these. So what you have in front of you is basically the culmination of our work on this over the last few months. And again, I will say that I am going to abstain from this vote because my wife owns a business in the Mill Industrial District. So, but I can answer any questions if you guys have questions.
Okay, great. Is there anyone here from the public or the city who would like to address the council concerning this act? You could just come to the podium, state your name, and address, please.
Jason Duda, 13 Winter Street. I'm also a member of the licensing board here in town. I have read this over and I heard what Councilor Derby had said, and I certainly don't have, as a member of the licensing commission, I don't really have any problems with this at all whatsoever. The only thing that Councilor Derby did mention about having an emphasis on certain areas of town, and I didn't see where that, you said it really wasn't specifically written into that. So is there some direction that would be given to any applicant who came for an over-quota license?
Well, what is written in here is that we will give, let me see if I can quote it here.
Highest preference.
Highest preference to applicants that are located within the mill industrial or downtown business districts.
And I guess I also need to ask is, how much has the ABCC already been consulted with the language of any of this?
So the language that we use from this is basically language that has been approved from our overquotas and from surrounding communities overquotas that went for bulk licenses.
Right.
And the legislature does review it as well.
Well, they would anyway.
Yes.
Right. So really the procedure for these licenses really wouldn't be that much different than the procedure would be for an overquota license as it stands now.
Correct.
Okay. All right.
Councilor Rist?
I'm not sure. Well, first, Jason, one of the things I was going to ask you is, in your experience, are these a valuable thing to have for the community in the sense that you know that they'll go, that they'll be used? I mean, I want to see businesses expand, especially restaurants, et cetera, in town.
Yes.
But I'm curious if you thought these would last 10 years? What did you say, 10 years?
10 years was our view.
I didn't think they would, but what do you think?
How do you mean last? You mean the license
Well, that
itself?
you would issue them within the 10-year period. I thought you'd issue them within a 5-year period easily.
Right. Well, but it's hard to say. As far as issuing them is concerned, there have been a couple of overquota licenses that were issued that I think, looking back, that maybe there should have been a little more scrutiny and or follow-up by the board itself. But I think over the last few years now that we've seen the demand for it, there has been more scrutiny because we understand how important they are. Now, as far as the issuing of them is concerned, I guess the best way I could answer that question, Councilor, is that it's very hard to say how quickly people would come in for this. I do like the provision that is specifically written in there, is that it's the same as an overquota license in that it cannot be transferred. It cannot be transferred or sold.
Right.
What I was going to mention, I had just forgotten, is the idea that it can't be transferred, but if the business stays under the same, if it's used for exactly the same, if a restaurant has an overquota license and it changes hands, that new owner of that restaurant, albeit one that's going to be using the license in the same manner, same fashion, wouldn't have to go for another overquota license. That was the language I was more concerned about, what the ABCC would say about it. I think, speaking for the board, we would have no problems with that at all whatsoever. I think that's logical. I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, you answered my first question. The second question might be more for Councilor Derby, but you might want to hear it. How do you enforce the preference I mean, if someone comes in and they're not in these zones, are they supposed to delay issuing that license till they see if others might come? I'm a little concerned about how that's enforced.
So the spirit of it is to try to encourage, some more development in those areas. However, we wanted to leave a little bit of a judgment on the part of the licensing board, which we felt that they would be able to do fairly easily. So if a business that was established and did not fall within one of these zones would not be completely shut out. So for example, if a year goes by and nobody applies for these, and Captain Jack's decides they want to get a license and they're in highway business, it would not preclude them from being able to get a license. However, if all of the licenses were applied for and there were people vying for them, then the preference would go to those projects that were in the mill industrial or downtown business.
Okay,
Does that clarify?
that clarifies.
Councilor Hagan?
Just a question for Jason. I know the last couple of overquotas, there was a little contentious between some of the board members. I think the board now is changed, the makeup of the board has changed from the last overquotas that were issued. And my question is, and a follow-up to that is, has there been any, I know there's no probably formal applications that have been filed, but has there been any, inquiries to the board, anyone come forward, asking about them or considering about overquotas?
I know there was one, maybe two, but there hasn't been, as of late, there really hasn't been that much activity of people inquiring about it. So it does lead one to the question is really how necessary is this?
Right, exactly.
And from my perspective, I don't really see the application process for an overquota license as it stands now to be all that cumbersome. Could see from the last few that have been issued in the last since I've been on the board, it wasn't that much of a hassle. I mean, there are more steps that have to be taken than if a business closes and there's an open license. I also personally think that the overquota license is a better tool in that it takes the monetary jockeying out of the equation entirely. Whereas maybe a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, there were some maybe hurt feelings about people who had spent money on their licenses, and now with the influx of or the interest in having overquota licenses, people, although they have to jump through hoops, they don't have to spend, upwards of $20,000-$25,000 to get a license when one comes free. I think a lot of those are going to start cycling out anyway. So I like the overquota system as it stands. I don't mind this language at all whatsoever. I think it's fine, and the idea of maybe trying to put some more emphasis on certain sections of town, I also think that those are sections of town where probably would see that kind of interest anyway. But certainly, again, from my perspective, I think the language is fine.
One more follow-up, and then do we have the call for beer and wine licenses? I know, again, going back, some of the others, they had a beer and wine, and then they upgrade.
Sure. Not so much lately, because I think there are a lot. I think there are a few who have beer wine licenses who would like to have a full alcohol license, and that came up a couple of years ago, and there were quite a few who were really interested in it. And this was the direction that we pushed them in and said, well, if you want that, go for an overquota. But not a lot did. And I think part of it, too, is I think, as we all know as members of the community, that there's not a lack of place to go in East Hampton to take advantage of a full bar. So I don't think it's such a huge demand.
Sorry, Councilor Winnie. Councilor Winnie?
On the last paragraph, if a license granted pursuant to this section is canceled, revoked, or no longer in use at the location of original issuances, the license shall be returned physically with all legal rights, privileges, and restrictions pertaining thereto to the licensing board, and may then grant the license to a new applicant at the same location under the same conditions as specified in the act. So there goes back to the earlier question that was posed that, so if somebody bought an existing restaurant that already had an over quota license, that license would automatically turn over to the new owner? Or no matter what, the licenses all have to go back to the licensing board to then be reissued to a new owner?
Correct.
I like that, because I think that anybody going into any kind of business needs, especially with alcohol, needs to be scrutinized and vetted out before that license gets turned over to them, so.
Councilor Winnie, and that's the way
Yeah.
I was assuming it as well, is it, I guess what I was saying before is it's not going back to the ABCC.
Right.
It's not like they have to start from the beginning.
Goes back
It comes
to
back
you.
to the licensing.
Yeah.
I was looking up
Okay.
here first.
I'm good with that.
Just to clarify, that's, Counselor Winnie, that's in the second to the last
Oh,
paragraph,
it's-
where it defines that it
All
comes
right,
back.
I didn't go to section 2, all right. Jeez.
Okay, Counselor Kuzinski.
That was one of my concerns also. In addition, it would seem that if we do nothing tonight, then the process becomes extended for anyone coming in and looking for a license. They would then have to start the whole process, go by us, go to the legislature. We shorten the process if we act today, and then you end up with 4 licenses in your possession. So somebody coming into town has a much shorter process
Right.
to set up their business or to or to accommodate a transfer. Does that make?
I agree, yeah.
By how much time do we save?
Well,
Is it 6 months to get through the legislature, a year?
Probably,
Well,
yeah.
it's definitely on the shoulders of the applicant to push the process along, because as you said, I mean, you pretty much explained exactly what the process is. They come to us for a recommendation, then they go to you for an endorsement, and then they go to the state legislature for it to be signed off on. Then it comes to us, back to the licensing board to then approve it, and then it goes to the ABCC to finally get approved. So there are a lot of steps involved with it. Although we have seen some people come in and get it done within a matter of a month and a half. It's those people were well prepared, and they put their, had their ducks in a row and knew what they were doing and knew who they had to talk to, and did it in a timely fashion. So, it can be cumbersome if you make it cumbersome.
Counselor Winnie.
No, I was just gonna say that, what this does is it takes it off the plate of us for at least 8 licenses. So they don't have to come to us to then have to go to the legislature, do the vote and all of that. So I think it's gonna streamline the process.
I'm not ignoring the right. I actually saw Counselor Smith's hand, and I called her Counselor Winnie. Counselor Smith, I'm sorry.
I just, when ordinance was meeting about this, some of the concerns that we had vetted, one was being a small city and having many children in the city and a lot of liquor establishments, how that would affect the youth. And I really think it's important to bring up that we have a very strong Healthy Youth Coalition within East Hampton that's received a lot of grant money for education for children. And I wouldn't feel comfortable bringing this forward if we hadn't considered that. And I've talked with members of the Healthy Youth Coalition who are saying similar things, that if this comes forth, they're aware. And the other thing that I really wanted to bring forth in regard to our reasoning for union, we are trying to be very respectful of the businesses that are already established within East Hampton and making sure that they're not feeling overcrowded, particularly when it comes to where are people going to go. And so picking Union Street as that median between the Cottage Street Cultural District and Main Street. If you look at the past few art walks, for example, they've really been trying to focus a lot and give more attention to that section of the city. So this really dovetails off of that as far as strategic planning. So I thought that should be a part of this conversation tonight as well.
Thank you. Counselor Hayes.
I have a couple of questions for Counselor Derby and the rest of you looked at this. So when you decided on number 8, were you looking at any sort of percentage with the population, the way they're initially done, like we have 1 per 1,000? And is that in line with the
Susan, I'm
amount?
sorry, Counselor, just ask, just so Jason can sit down, does anyone have any more questions for?
No, it's okay, I don't mind.
Oh,
I
okay,
just-
you also,
I-
okay,
my
okay.
backwards,
Go
that's
ahead
all.
down, okay, sorry.
That if we are in line with the percentage increase that the other communities that you mentioned with, where Hadley had gotten so many.
So you're correct that standard liquor licenses are awarded on a per capita basis. We did not use that formula to come to the number 8. What we did was we threw around some ideas of what we thought East Hampton could bear, and looked at the surrounding communities, how many they went for, and obviously we didn't go for as many as Holyoke or Northampton or Hadley, but we wanted to make sure that we had enough that would entice businesses that might want to come to East Hampton, might want to open in East Hampton, so we could find that new growth. And we thought that 4 full and 4 beer and wine was that sweet spot.
Okay. And then I was also wondering if you had tied this with establishments that serve food, or these could just be bar rooms.
We did not tie it directly to, how do you say it? Victualers? Victualler?
Common victualler.
Yes. But that's more of the spirit, that it would be tied to a restaurant or affiliated with, some sort of an establishment that's already in existence, not just like a hole in the wall bar necessarily.
Okay, but I don't really see that reflected here in any way.
We did not tie it. We did not tie it.
And then the other question I had is, I think it would make sense for like the breweries in town to just upgrade their licenses, So these would be available to all the pour license that we just put out as well?
Counselor Ziegler, did you have just one?
Well, I was going to actually follow up with Councilor Sikowski's question regarding the facilitation of the licenses, and it was the original, I'm sorry.
That was a bad slip.
I do apologize, JP. It was my intent to follow up regarding the question of the facilitation, and now I'm off track. It was the original intent that we would be trying to make East Hampton more desirable for the businesses who may be considering a location within the valley. And if you have towns that already have licenses available versus having to start the process from the very beginning, that was, part of the consideration in doing so. And again, proposing 8 licenses, we did look at the number of individuals within the residents within the city. And again, that was, part of the consideration, of course, with the youth and everything else, that we're not overly heavy with establishments that serve alcohol. But again, it was considered the number over a 10-year expansion, but not following the 1,000 the 1,000 limit. But just to follow up again, it was specifically meant to be more business friendly, if you will.
Counselor Riss?
Just following up on Councilor Winnie had asked about the transfer of a license, or how a licensee who was canceled, revoked, or no longer in use at the location. And I don't know if this is a question for Jason or Councilor Derby, but if a license is removed and returned to the licensing board from a location, does the licensing board have the flexibility to send that license to a new location, or is it that once it's issued at this location, it has to stay there? Always has to stay there?
Yep.
Even though no restaurant wants it now or nobody moves in?
Yep.
Really?
I mean, that's the way we.
That's the, really?
I think
It seems too
that's,
bad.
That's the from all of the overquotas that we did, from all of the ones that we researched, That's the language that the legislature approves.
And that is the defining difference
Right.
between a regular license and an.
Is it's
overquota license.
non-transferable.
Which is
Well, no, I'm not saying that they would transfer it. I was suggesting that the licensing board, who physically has it in hand, they have 4 now that they can issue to any location. Why can't they get that one back and issue it to a new location? It's still the licensing board doing it. I'm not saying that the owner transfers it. I'm saying the licensing board has the flexibility. I'm asking if that's possible. Do you?
No, I would say no. Not,
can't.
not,
Once
not,
it's issued
not
to a
with
location,
this,
it stays
no.
there.
Because that, if you think about it, that would be kind of like the state just giving us these new licenses, not calling them over quota licenses, which they still technically are.
Right.
So if you're not going to use the language of over quota, then it's an actual license, which we don't have. It's still not a license it's a license we have, but it's not a free license that we get based on our population. So it still is it's governed by those same principles or the same rules in which it's there and it stays there.
So if I understand it, if you issue a license to a restaurant and the restaurant fails and decides not to be a restaurant,
Right.
and the building is turned into some other retail outlet, a convenience store, we lose the ability to use that license still stays there.
I think there's still a little gray area there. I mean, if
That's
they,
why I was asking.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think that your example that you just gave quite clearly know that license wouldn't be able to go back at that same location. But I mean, if a restaurant that was a full service restaurant with a liquor license, over quota liquor license, under these provisions, if they closed and the license goes back to the licensing board, I think that if that in the same location, that license could be reissued to something that was quite similar. Doesn't have to be exactly the same, but it would.
But
it would
you don't
to
have
be,
the right to move it to a new location, no matter what
Nope.
happens.
No.
Okay.
They can be used up.
Okay, cool.
Any additional
Oh, they can
questions
use that.
for, that's why Council Hagan.
I have one for Salem or the committee. During any of your deliberations, did any of the, and I'll call them the transferable liquor license, people that have the transferable liquor licenses, the 15 or 16, did they come to anybody oppose this, I guess?
No, we didn't hear anything from anybody. And the first over quota license we did, Casey came and was against it because he had bought a license for the Apollo. But he eventually ended up getting an over quota for Galaxy. So, since then we haven't really had anybody come oppose.
Councilor Hayes?
I think I really would like to see language in here tying it with a food establishment.
I can respect that, and that was one of the things that was talked about. We specifically left it out because we weren't sure. We weren't sure what type of, if someone came up with a really interesting idea that wasn't a restaurant, we didn't want to necessarily tie it to serving food. And part of this process is, having the flexibility to allow people to be creative about the businesses that they want to open. And it might not necessarily be a restaurant. It might be a brewery.
I can hear that, but I don't think it's the licensing board to necessarily be like a design review board on whether or not they like the concept of somebody's business. That shouldn't have, it should be applied fairly to everybody. And if they don't like the idea of a pool hall, or they do like the idea of a wine bar, they can't really pick one over the other.
But neither of those serve food.
Did you want to speak that to Councilor Ziegler?
Yes, I was just going to say, and again, as applying all things fairly, I heard the term earlier, a hole-in-the-wall establishment, but there could be a hole-in-the-wall establishment somewhere that would be in a location that might be prime for food trucks. And under the circumstances, that would be a viable business here. So we weren't looking necessarily to limit it. Obviously, we would like to see many restaurants within the
Right.
city limits, but
Right.
we didn't want to just limit it and say, okay, well, we're going to carve so many out for just restaurants versus. non-food.
I mean, because my thought is that breweries are already set up. They already have all the insurance in place, they already have the bars set up, they already have a lot of their permitting in order. And if I was that business owner, I would jump on this in a hot second. I mean, I think that's what's gonna happen with your first 3 licenses. Well, bam. I mean, it might not be something that people wanna take on right away, but I see that happening.
Any additional comments? Jason, I will let you sit down. I did have one question for you, if you don't mind. You're sure? Okay.
Can I, before we go on, would you be opposed to that?
No.
Okay, I just wasn't sure if that was part of your,
Oh, no, I mean, I think these are, there's some businesses in town that are prime that are gonna just absolutely jump on this right away. You know, I think possibly the Mexican restaurant that's in town that has beer and wine, and I know they've wanted a full liquor license. So I see these 4 going immediately, and that not bringing in any new businesses, just improving what we have, which is great and not a bad thing.
Jason, a question, just because this does come up, people ask me, oh, I'm afraid of too many liquor licenses. Without being too exhaustive, there are quite a few regulations are already in place for protecting things like distances from school, distances from churches. Is there anything else you could speak to about, or is that pretty much it?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, to what Counselor Hayes had said, I mean, it is true that the licensing board, it doesn't, there's no design review or anything like that, certainly. It is taken into consideration what the feasibility of what the business is. I know I'm not answering your question immediately, but certainly I just wanted to speak to that. There is some consideration as to, well, what is the feasibility of this? Now, to your question, yeah, I mean, we definitely, there are things that are, as you said, that we're mandated to go by. And we certainly look at where it's being placed all the time. Is this really appropriate for what is going to go on here? So yes, it all that is taken into consideration whenever there's any kind of liquor license that comes before us.
Okay. Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I have one question for the committee.
I'm sorry, I don't know, maybe because I've had back
Jason.
pain, I just want
I know.
to, is there anyone from?
No.
any
Let
for-
the poor man sit.
I think Counselor Winnie just likes me. At attention.
I do, Jason, I do like you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so any continued discussion here.
One of the questions that has come up into my mind is, in regards to having 4 all alcoholic and then 4 wine and beer, would it be prudent to change that number to a higher amount of all beer?
You mean
Or higher to all liquor as opposed to doing 4 and 4? The only reason why I'm saying that is Counselor Hayes makes a very good point that I don't know how many. Do you know how many beer and wine licenses that are out there that aren't taken? Do we have any available out there? Just yes or no?
Yes, we know.
Yes, there are, or no, there isn't.
Beer and wine.
Beer and
Do we have
wine.
any free licenses?
Beer and
open
wine.
Licenses right now? No, we do not.
Okay, so they've all been taken. All right.
I'm sorry. I thought you were asking, are there any that have been issued that aren't being used?
Oh, yeah.
That's
a good question too.
That's
Are there?
That's a yes.
We don't have that.
Yes, there are.
Yeah.
There's one that I know of, yeah.
I think there's
Is it beer and wine or all alcohol?
It's a full license.
Full license.
Chapman.
I think it's a.
But I think he's working to.
No,
Okay,
it's
all right.
legislative, it's Will Bundy's, that's the one that he bought from Casey, that's not being used.
Okay, so,
There's 2.
all right, with that being said, eventually that will probably get used, obviously.
We use any.
So I just, I don't know, do you think it might make sense to do this beforehand, now, going forward, to increase the number of all liquor
6 and 2.
than
ambivalent.
just going 4 and 4? I'm just throwing it out there for everybody to just kind of think about and and to discuss. You know, Counselor Hayes raises a valid point that she's thinking that 4 will automatically jump right onto the all alcohol, and of course then that would open up the beer and wines on the other hand, or so, I don't know.
Counselor Riss, I saw his here
My
first.
my only question is, how many, going to the fact that maybe some current beer and wine licenses would want to upgrade, do you have a quantity of beer and wine licenses currently issued over quotas in town?
There's no
Number.
over quota beer and wine.
So there are no beer, there were some beer and wine, but they're regular licenses?
Regular.
They're all,
So a regular license, beer and wine could upgrade using this over quota to full alcohol if they want to.
And if I'm not mistaken, I believe the original license would go back to the licensing board. And
So with that in mind, then Councilor Sweeney's suggestion might be pertinent, because if we go to 6 all alcohol, or even 8, the beer and wine licenses that are currently out there that are not over quota would go back to the licensing board, so we will still have those available to businesses that really don't want to go all alcohol. So by changing the number, we are not necessarily limiting ourselves, because we still have the beer and wine capability of those licenses that would go back to the licensing board. Am I correct on that?
yeah, that's how I'm thinking, yeah.
I saw Counselor Smith.
Okay, I was going to ask if we were going to make those change. I think we should consider putting, at least for some of them, the food, what Counselor Hayes was talking about, putting the food as part of the establishment. Not all of them, but I would like to see some of them that way.
I mean, I think if you feel strong about it, it could be made as an amendment to the motion when the motion is made. If you
Need to be in writing, though.
I think we'd have to send that back
You'd
to
have to.
committee
Yeah.
for that kind of
Okay,
language change.
Counselor Hayes.
I know, nobody knows anybody's name tonight. Now I forget what I was gonna say.
Happened to me earlier too, so.
Somebody else go, I'll remember.
Counselor Hagan.
I guess I'm thinking of what Counselor Hayes said earlier, and if we're trying to channel these to one particular area, and it seems like a consensus, and maybe not something we want to restrict, we're trying to also kind of have it part of food. I think keeping it the way it's currently before the committee makes more sense, because I think very few people would open up a pure alcohol establishment with no food that's beer and wine. But if they get a full liquor license, then they could open up a full bar and not have to have the food. I think food establishments would take both, but I do think that if you have too many of the all liquor, then you could get more of a chance of someone coming forward and saying, I'm just gonna open up a straight bar. Yeah, that would be my opinion to keep it 4 and 4.
Counselor Hayes?
I remembered.
Okay.
So the city is at our limit with beer and wine licenses only.
all licenses.
All of them.
All of them,
So full liquor, beer and wine.
Okay.
they're all issued.
That's why it's over.
I didn't know we had a limit on those. How many beer and wine licenses? I know we have 16 full liquor because of our population. How many beer and wine onlys do we have?
Can you help us, Jason?
You don't need to get up, Jason.
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you.
Looks like Mary knows.
This is a preview. Wine and malt restaurant licenses are current for Village Pizza at 100 Union Street, East Hampton Diner at 117 Union, and La Casita Azteca at 58 Cottage. And those are the wine and malt restaurant licenses.
There's only 3.
So, I mean, I didn't think we had a limit in town on beer and wine. I thought that was something that we could.
No, there's one that's.
Yeah,
There's some
no,
seasonal
state-
licenses which can.
Seasonal.
Seasonal as well. So,
Plus, the
I mean,
breweries have special licenses now.
does it seem like we would probably have maybe the same amount as all alcohol licenses?
No.
I'm sorry, so you're thinking we should ask for 16, or, I mean,
The city has 3 beer and wine licenses. And we're saying we're maxed
Well,
at
that's how
3.
many are issued.
by
By
the
the
population.
state
Right.
population, by the state
They're the
numbers, yeah.
transferable.
And that seems a lot less than the 16 all alcohol. Like, I have trouble believing that we only have 3 in the city to hand out.
Don't know.
So, I mean, if we have 10,
Oh, Mary, sorry, if you
Sorry,
can help
Mary.
us out, that'd be
I
great.
think
Yeah,
they're,
yeah, okay. So those are the three beer and wine restaurant licenses, Village Pizza, East Hampton Diner, and La Casita Azteca. William Bundy over at Eastworks owns a general on-premise beer and wine for his event space.
right,
Luthier's has a general on-premise
right. they have
wine and malt.
wine, yeah.
And then you've got your three breweries.
Right, and then the breweries.
We have
yeah.
5
Okay, so-
generals that can be transferred.
Yeah. Sounds about right.
but we don't know what the limit is for the city. So we could have a limit of like 10 beer and wine licenses, which means we wouldn't necessarily need these 4
I don't
legislative.
think we have any available licenses.
We have none available. Jason says
Jason, are
that.
you able to help us out on that?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, do you know, the question is how, as I believe it is, how many beer and wine licenses we have?
That off the top of
I
my
think
head.
she
No,
said
available.
five.
It's,
5.
I have the list.
But as far as you know, we have no extra.
I don't believe we do.
We don't have any available at this moment.
I don't believe we do, no.
Okay.
Because I know Shelburne Falls Coffee Roasters had gotten one, and I know that came back. I don't know where that ended up.
Oh, sorry, let me go down here this time, Councilor Krasinski.
I like the idea of extending to 8 full. And I like the idea of tying a portion of those to restaurants. It seems to help move our city forward in terms of expanding the possibilities and yet still indicating that we really would like to see some of the licenses be used in restaurants and for certain purposes. If this requires us to go back to committee to discuss that some more, I'm certainly in favor of that.
I tend,
I think I saw, Joy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with that. I still think because we're at our full capacity for beer and wine, there's a lot of places or a lot of restaurants or whatever that will come in and just want a beer and wine and not want it. I mean, specialized wine. You know, a restaurant comes in and they're going to go with high-end wines and whatever. They're only going to want the beer and wine license. They're not going to want to get into the mixologies of the full liquor licenses. So I really think that having some over quota beer and wine licenses available because we're at our max makes sense in a lot of ways too. So
Just to comment on that,
Yeah.
just quickly. I can see that point, but if I were in business and what was available was a full license and I didn't want to serve full alcohol, doesn't prohibit me, it wouldn't prohibit you from serving high-end wines, I would assume. You could still have the full license and restrict yourself as to what you serve, I think.
point.
Councilor Rist?
I was going to say that I tend to agree that we should go with a few more full alcohol, only because if we're thinking, as I think Councilor Hayes mentioned, that a current beer and wine licensee, which has a general license, which would go back to licensing board, it could be transferred, would want to upgrade with the over quota, then we're not limiting ourselves with the beer and wine, Councilor Winnie. So I think we would still have those available. But I don't think I want to go to 8, but I see 6 and 2 as being possible. I'm not sure if tying it to food is necessary, and I'm only saying that because, and I'm not sure, maybe the committee needs to discuss it more, but tying it to food seems limiting. This doesn't preclude, Councilor Derby, someone coming in from a restaurant that's already serving, that plans a restaurant, they're gonna serve food, and they only want a all alcohol license. They could still serve food. What you're trying to do is establish some of them, or what the suggestion is, establish some of them, they have to be food. And I think that's a restriction that we don't want to make because we want to open up more business possibilities. It doesn't prevent someone from having a restaurant with food, but it also allows for a bar that doesn't want to serve food.
Or something even more creative.
More creative. I'd like to keep the food idea out of it, but I would be willing to go to 6 only because of the notion that people would upgrade. And I will actually make that in a form of an amendment. If we want to do food, you'd have to send it back to committee, I believe, for new language, because it's too much of a change. But changing a number from 4 to 6 and 4 to 2 doesn't, to me, need further committee discussion unless the council wants them to do that. That's up to the council.
So are you making that, did you write
I
that
will,
out?
well, when
Every emotion.
the motions are ready to be
Okay.
brought forward, because I don't know if the public's done
I
or.
saw, Council Hayes, you had your hand up?
I would also be in favor of sending this back to committee. My apologies. But I think that, we do have a couple of members of the press here. We've brought up a lot of interesting points. I think we're going to be hearing from the community about this. And I think we need to give ourselves a little bit of space to incorporate that. Because, everybody's brought up a lot of great points. And I'm sure there's some information and some points that we haven't thought of. There's some compelling pros and cons on both sides of this, because I've been looking at it for a while, and speaking with business owners, and as a, restaurant consultant myself, and looking at this, the way you can, the margin on a restaurant is really small, and your alcohol sales are where you're gonna actually make your money. So that's why I'm kind of saying that, is that anybody who's doing beer and wine, you're gonna make a better margin on this. If I had a beautiful craft beer bar with just my beer and wine license, I would love to have a selection of really great bourbon to go with it. Maybe not necessarily a full bar, but there are many, many ways these licenses can be interpreted and used, and you're right with the food. I like the idea of tying it to the food, but if somebody wants to open up a really cool, arcade and serve beer at it, that sounds cool too. So you don't want to limit, but I think we need to look at this. I think we need some public feedback. I'm kind of disappointed that we don't have anybody from the public here, because it seems like an issue that people would really care about and want some input on.
Council Durbin.
So just to speak to the process just a little bit, our committee did have 3 meetings specifically to discuss this. This public hearing right now is not necessary. The committee decided to hold a public hearing as a courtesy to the community, but this particular topic does not require a public hearing. So I feel pretty comfortable with the amount of time and it's been in the paper. All of our meetings were advertised. This meeting was advertised, so I'm comfortable, moving this forward. And I would actually agree with Councilor Rist that I think that number would be acceptable.
6 and 2.
Councilor Ziegler.
I too am in agreement with not only the process being open and over an extended period of time, but also with the 6 and 2. But I also just wanted to say I appreciated Councilor Hagan's suggestion too regarding keeping some of the beer and wine just for more of the innovative purposes, or those are more of the ones that'll probably be tied with food. And so I've been back and forth between 4 and 4, but I completely agree that by keeping them just beer and wine, it does allow for those more niche markets, or potentially your restaurateurs.
So you're okay with 6 and 2?
I'm completely fine with 6 and 2 though, just because of the upgrades.
Councilor Hagan.
Again, I like the 4 and 4 that the committee came up with. I think there was a lot of deliberation. You said you had 3 meetings, and again, to change it at the 11th hour, I guess I support the committee, maybe we can even compromise at 5 and 3. But again, I'll leave it for a voter when somebody actually makes a motion. But I do appreciate the work of the committee, and I think it was vetted pretty well.
Councilor Rist.
The only reason I suggested 6, just to re-inform the committee, is the notion that a current all-alcohol license owner beer and wine owner with a standard license would upgrade to all alcohol. That gives us the beer and wine license back. And what's good about that license, it's not tied to a location. It's a regular license, and it can go to a new owner in a new location. So we're not losing beer and wine, which is why I'm suggesting we go to 6, because the other hand, if a lot of these all alcohols get used up, if we only had 4, they get used up by people wanting to expand to all alcohol, then we're stuck with 4 beer and wine plus the 4 all alcohols that were used to be beer and wine, and we have 8 of them.
Yeah.
So my feeling is have more of the all alcohol, because we're not going to lose the beer and wine, because I'm thinking of the upgrades that'll happen. I think that's very possible. So that was my reasoning anyway.
I agree.
Councilor Hayes.
So If we vote on this tonight, I'm going to be abstaining because both of these areas are in District 2, and I don't feel like I've done my due diligence with talking to people in the community that this is going to directly affect. And I didn't mean that to sound like you guys have not put forward. I mean, we don't get a lot of public input. It's really hard. And I don't want to misstep on this, especially as someone who works in restaurants. I bartend. I have a lot of friends who own a lot of the restaurants in town. I need to talk to people and see how people feel about this. Because I think there's great compelling arguments on both sides. I really don't feel strongly, right now, one way or the other.
I think I saw Counselor Smith's hand first.
I'm not sure who brought it up, but when we're looking at the alcohol, the beer and wine, or wine and malt licenses becoming available, I just want to be clear, we're not talking about over quota licenses. They were talking about existing licenses.
Right.
So the cost is much different. Like, there's a whole different set of parameters for non-over quota versus over quota. So I didn't want to not have that come out as part of the knowledge in this process. I mean,
Yes, there's a
yes,
cost
they would become available, but at a much higher cost. So now you might have 2 licenses that are over quota at a much different cost for the restaurateur or the bar, the bar, than the over quota one. And that, I think, could cause a lot more friction than having them,
That cost, though, is market-driven, and that cost may very well have, because of these, may very well have dropped precipitously. Did you have your, Councilor Kwasinski, too, at one time?
I did, but,
Okay, and I saw Councilor Riss.
My suggestion, given what Counselor Hayes has said, and that we've all been thinking about this a lot, the committee has done a lot of due diligence on it, but most of us have just started really looking at it as often we put a lot of burden on our committees to give us the information. I'm going to suggest that we continue this public hearing to the next meeting, not to change anything in it, unless the committee wants to come back and change it, and maybe Counselor Hayes has time to talk to people, but that we vote on it at the next meeting. I'm going to make a suggestion that we do that. It's just a suggestion. I'm not making a motion to do that. I'm just suggesting that that's what I think we ought to do.
let me say, if you put that in the form of a motion, I would second and vote in favor of that.
Okay, Counselor.
Councilor,
Well, I was actually, I think what Counselor Smith brought up about the cost brings up a really good point. So, if the cost of buying, say, one of those beer and wine licenses that can be sold, that isn't tied to a location because it's not a legislative license, will people still be able to apply for legislative licenses if we use up all of these 8 as well, right? So there wouldn't be a reason for them to pay the market rate for any of the licenses because they could just go for the over limit
If it becomes available
if
because
it
one of
becomes
these
available,
upgrades, yeah.
right?
Yeah. I was going to say, just to clarify, I believe what would happen if someone upgraded to an over quota from a beer and wine, it would go back to the licensing board, and it would be the licensing board's discretion to reissue that.
Yeah.
There would be no costs involved.
Right.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Councilor Wynn.
That's what I was gonna say. If somebody that's holding a beer and malt or wine and malt license right now and want to upgrade, they are going to have to they won't be able to sell that license. They are going to have to physically turn that license into the licensing board to do the upgrade. There's not gonna be any selling or buying
Right,
of those
right.
licenses. It's a quid pro quo. You're gonna take it, you're gonna give it back to the licensing board and then apply for the full liquor license, which then encompasses that plus more.
Councilor Riss.
Mr. President, if it's appropriate, I'll make the motion that we continue this public hearing to the next meeting. And at that time, I'd ask the committee to seek out numbers from the current licenses that are held in town, because that seemed to be a question. That's
Second.
part of the motion.
Okay, well, there's a motion and a second. Any more discussion concerning the continuation? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Oppose? Abstain? Motion passes.
Mr. President, I move that public hearings be closed.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to close public hearings. All those in favor?
Continued.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, yeah, we continue.
We continued the last,
That
that was the
public
motion.
hearing.
Close today's.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstained, motion passes.
we continued, we're closing this session of public
Tonight's session.
session.
We're continuing the public hearings to the next meeting, right? Is that correct?
There's only one public hearing.
Well, all
It has been continued.
All right, good, forget it.
So we are continuing.
Well, I'm just asking if you can get the numbers of current licenses, both beer and wine and
Yeah.
alcohol that are listed, so.
Okay,
that's
I believe
easy.
we're caught up with old business, new business, so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move that we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
See you on the 4th. Thank you.
I didn't know if you wanted.